execute judgment on you, Satan, you destroyer, you killer, you get out, you break your power, you get off this nation. I demand judgment on you.
Kenneth Copeland, one of America's wealthiest and most controversial televangelists, was sentenced to life imprisonment today after a stunning trial that exposed decades of financial fraud and tax evasion. The 87-year-old founder of Kenneth Copeland Ministries showed no emotion as Judge Martin Reynolds delivered the maximum sentence, effectively ending the preacher's empire that once spanned continents and reached millions of followers worldwide. The case against Copeland began 3 years ago when a former financial officer at Kenneth Copeland Ministries turned whistleblower, providing federal investigators with thousands of documents detailing what prosecutors called the largest religious fraud scheme in American history. Michael Thornton, who had served as deputy financial controller for the ministry for 14 years, secretly copied financial records, offshore account details, and internal communications before leaving the organization in 2020. I couldn't be part of it anymore, Thornton testified during the trial. Watching people send their last dollars while Mr. Copeland used their sacrificial giving to buy yet another jet or property, it broke me. I knew God was calling me to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The subsequent investigation by the IRS, FBI, and Department of Justice uncovered evidence that Copeland had personally diverted over $150 million in church donations to fund his lavish lifestyle, including his fleet of private jets, multiple mansions, and luxury vehicles. Bank records revealed that Copeland had spent $17.5 million on private aircraft in a single year, while claiming to donors that their funds were supporting missionary work and humanitarian efforts. Prosecutors demonstrated that Copeland had created an elaborate network of shell companies and offshore accounts to hide assets from the IRS. The ministry had established more than 30 separate entities across the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Liechtenstein that served no legitimate religious purpose but functioned to obscure the flow of funds. Most damaging was evidence that he had instructed staff to falsify donation records and ministry expenses to maintain the organization's tax-exempt status, while using the ministry as his personal bank account. The defendant didn't just blur the line between ministry funds and personal use. He erased it entirely. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Wilson told the jury, "For Mr. Copeland, the ministry's bank accounts were his bank accounts. Donor dollars didn't go to spread the gospel, they went to spread his empire." The courtroom in Fort Worth, Texas was packed with former followers throughout the trial, many of whom had donated significant portions of their life savings to Copeland's ministry after his promises that God would multiply their gifts. Some attendees openly wept as details of the fraud were described during the 7-week trial, particularly when prosecutors played videos of Copeland soliciting seed faith donations from financially vulnerable followers while flying between his numerous properties on ministry-funded private jets. One video from 2018 showed Copeland telling viewers, "The Lord said to me, 'Tell my people to give their best offering ever, and I will cancel their debts.'" Immediately following this broadcast, the ministry received over $20 million in donations, of which prosecutors proved $6 million went directly to purchasing a waterfront property in Florida under a shell company controlled by Copeland family members. The defendant preyed upon the faith and trust of thousands of sincere believers, said U.S. Attorney Caroline Marchand during her closing arguments. He exploited their religious devotion for personal gain while claiming divine approval for his actions. This case isn't about religious freedom. It's about fraud, plain and simple. Copeland's defense team, led by high-profile attorney James Morrison, had attempted to portray the case as government persecution of religious organizations. They argued that the luxurious lifestyle was necessary for Copeland's worldwide ministry and that donors understood their contributions would support his work, including his travel needs. The prosperity gospel that Mr. Copeland preaches includes the belief that God rewards faithfulness with material blessings, Morrison told the court. His lifestyle was a testament to the very principles he espoused, and his followers understood this. These weren't secrets. The jets and properties were visible symbols of the success of his ministry and the truth of his teachings. This defense strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented recorded conversations between Copeland and his financial advisors, discussing how to shield the jets from government busybodies and keep the real numbers away from the sheep, referring to his followers. In one particularly damning recording from 2017, Copeland could be heard laughing about a widow who donated her insurance payout, saying, "She thinks she's getting a heavenly return, but the only return is my new hanger." The prosecution also introduced internal emails directing staff to create fake mission projects for fundraising campaigns that had no actual operations. One email from Copeland to his son John instructed him to create some pictures of those African children we supposedly helped for a fundraising broadcast. Perhaps most devastating to the defense was testimony from former ministry insiders who described a culture of fear and secrecy within the organization. Sarah Williams, who worked as Copeland's personal assistant for 8 years, testified that staff were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and were threatened with both legal action and divine punishment if they questioned financial practices. He told us that questioning his spending was questioning God himself, Williams testified. He said anyone who exposed ministry business would face God's wrath. We were all terrified, not just of losing our jobs, but of eternal damnation. Williams described how staff members who raised concerns about financial irregularities were immediately terminated and branded as influenced by demonic forces. Former employees were often subjected to public condemnation during service broadcasts, with Copeland telling his audience that these individuals had aligned themselves with Satan to attack God's work. The prosecution also presented evidence that Copeland had knowingly solicited donations for disaster relief efforts and missionary work that were instead diverted to business ventures and property acquisitions. Bank records showed that less than 3% of funds raised for Hurricane Katrina victims ever reached relief organizations, while millions went to a real estate investment company owned by the Copeland family that purchased distressed properties in the affected areas. David Martinez, former director of international missions for the ministry, testified that he was instructed to create fictional reports about missionary activities that never occurred. "I was told to write detailed reports about schools and hospitals we had supposedly built in developing countries," Martinez said. "In reality, those projects didn't exist. When I expressed concern," Mr. Copeland told me, "the donors need to feel good about giving. The details don't matter." The trial took an unexpected turn when Eagle Mountain International Church, the legal name for Copeland's primary ministry organization, attempted to distance itself from Copeland's actions. Church board members filed a motion claiming they had been unaware of the financial improprieties and should not be held liable for Copeland's individual actions. This move backfired when prosecutors produced board meeting minutes showing the members had repeatedly approved transactions moving funds from ministry accounts to Copeland's personal control. Further investigation revealed that board members had received significant personal benefits, including luxury vehicles, all expense-paid vacations classified as ministry retreats, and housing allowances despite not having official ministerial duties. As the guilty verdict was read last week, Copeland remained stoic, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorneys. His wife Gloria and other family members, who have been conspicuously absent from most of the proceedings, were not present for the verdict or today's sentencing. Sources close to the family indicated that significant tension had developed as various members sought to protect their own interests. During today's sentencing hearing, Judge Reynolds allowed impact statements from several former followers. Mary Thompson, a 76-year-old widow from Oklahoma, described how she donated her entire retirement savings of $340,000 to Copeland's ministry after her husband's death. "Mr. Copeland promised me that if I showed my faith through giving, God would restore it many times over," Thompson told the court, her voice breaking. "He said it was fear and lack of faith to keep money in savings when it could be planted as seed. Now I live with my daughter because I can't afford housing. While he flew in private jets, I lost everything." Robert Castillo, a former ministry partner from Houston, described how his family donated more than $800,000 over 15 years, much of it borrowed against their home and business, believing they were supporting international mission work. "We remortgaged everything we had because Mr. Copeland told us God would bring a 100-fold return. Instead, we lost our business, our home, and nearly our marriage," Castillo said. The worst part wasn't the financial loss, but the spiritual devastation of realizing we'd been deceived by someone we trusted as a man of God. Perhaps the most emotional testimony came from Janet Williams, no relation to Sarah Williams, who described how her late husband had refused potentially life-saving cancer treatment in favor of faith healing promoted by Copeland's ministry. My husband declined medical treatment and instead sent $25,000 to the ministry's healing school. She testified. Mr. Copeland personally told him that seeking medical treatment showed a lack of faith that would prevent his healing. He died believing he hadn't been faithful enough. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Copeland surprised many by declining to express remorse. Instead, he quoted scripture and maintained that his ministry had helped millions of people worldwide. "The Lord knows my heart," Copeland said, standing straight despite his age. "This ministry has brought salvation and healing to countless souls across the globe. Man may judge, but God's judgment is what matters. Like the Apostle Paul, I am persecuted for preaching prosperity, but I have kept the faith. I regret nothing because my conscience is clear before God Almighty." Judge Reynolds was unmoved by this response. In delivering the life sentence, he criticized Copeland's extraordinary lack of remorse and the calculated nature of these crimes over decades. "You systematically exploited faith for financial gain," Reynolds stated, his voice stern. "The court cannot ignore the magnitude of this fraud or the vulnerability of the victims who trusted you as a spiritual leader. This sentence reflects not only the financial harm you've caused, but the spiritual damage to those who trusted you." Reynolds continued, "The First Amendment protects religious freedom, including the right to preach prosperity theology or any other doctrine. What it does not protect is fraud committed under the guise of religion. You didn't just fail as a minister, you deliberately deceived those who trusted you most completely. In addition to the life sentence for fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion, the court ordered the forfeiture of assets worth approximately $240 million, including Copeland's 1,500-acre lakefront property near Fort Worth, his fleet of aircraft including a Gulfstream 5 and Citation X, and numerous real estate holdings across Texas, Colorado, Florida, and California. The judge also ordered restitution to identified victims, though prosecutors acknowledged that recovering funds for all affected donors would be impossible given the decades-long scope of the fraud. The sentencing included a separate judgment against Eagle Mountain International Church as an organization, with the court appointing a receiver to manage its assets and determine which could be liquidated for victim compensation. The ruling specifically protected legitimate religious functions while separating them from the vast commercial empire built through fraudulent means. As Copeland was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, reactions among spectators were mixed. Some former followers appeared vindicated, while others seemed stunned that the man they had revered for decades would spend the rest of his life behind bars. "I never thought I'd see this day," said Thomas Richardson, a former ministry donor who had traveled from California for the sentencing. "For years, questioning Kenneth Copeland was like questioning God himself in our community. The manipulation was so complete that even seeing the evidence, some people still can't accept the truth." Outside the courthouse, hundreds of supporters gathered with signs proclaiming Copeland's innocence and claiming religious persecution. Many cited Bible verses about persecution and prophesied divine intervention to free Copeland. Some held signs reading, "Touch not God's anointed" and "Free God's prophet." Diane Reynolds, who identified herself as a 30-year follower of Copeland's ministry, told reporters, "This is spiritual warfare, plain and simple. The government is persecuting a man of God because they fear his message. Brother Copeland helped millions find faith and prosperity. These charges are Satan's attempt to stop the gospel." A smaller group of former followers celebrated the verdict, with some describing the relief of seeing accountability for what they called decades of spiritual abuse and financial exploitation. Several former members had formed support groups during the trial process, finding healing in shared experiences after years of what many described as religious trauma. As for Copeland himself, at 87, the life sentence effectively ensures he will spend his remaining years in federal prison. He has been designated to serve his term at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, a facility for inmates requiring specialized medical care, keeping him near the empire he built and lost. The psychological impact on his followers remains one of the most profound aspects of the case. Dr. John Lavish, a sociologist specializing in cults and high-control groups, explained, "For people who built their entire faith system around Copeland's teachings, this conviction is psychologically devastating. They're experiencing what we call the reality shock when the constructed reality they've lived in suddenly collapses. Support groups for former followers have emerged across the country, many led by licensed therapists specializing in religious trauma. These groups report being overwhelmed with people seeking help processing their experiences and rebuilding their faith or establishing new belief systems. "I lost 30 years of my life and thousands of dollars to this ministry," said Emily Cartwright, who now leads a support group in Dallas. "But the worst loss was my authentic relationship with God, which was replaced with fear, performance, and financial exploitation. Many of us are having to completely rebuild our spiritual lives from scratch." The broader prosperity gospel movement, which teaches that God rewards increased faith and donations with material blessing, appears to be undergoing a reformation in the wake of the scandal. Several prominent prosperity preachers have modified their messages, placing greater emphasis on spiritual growth and responsible stewardship rather than material wealth. Copeland's attorneys have already announced plans to appeal, claiming procedural errors and constitutional overreach. Lead attorney James Morrison told reporters outside the courthouse, "This conviction represents government intrusion into religious matters in violation of the First Amendment." Mr. Copeland operated a ministry according to his sincerely held religious beliefs about prosperity. "We will appeal this verdict and expect it to be overturned on constitutional grounds." Legal experts note that the overwhelming evidence and comprehensive financial documentation make a successful appeal unlikely. The prosecution was careful to focus solely on financial crimes rather than questioning religious doctrines. And Judge Reynolds repeatedly instructed the jury to consider only the financial evidence, not Copeland's theological positions. For the thousands of followers who once viewed Kenneth Copeland as a divinely appointed messenger, today's sentence marks the end of an era and the beginning of a painful reckoning with decades of misplaced trust. Many former donors expressed a complex mix of emotions: relief at seeing justice served, anger at having been deceived, and grief over the spiritual manipulation they experienced. "I believed in him completely," said Margaret Wilson, a former donor from Arkansas. "I sent money I couldn't afford because I truly believed God would honor that seed and multiply it. Today I feel both vindicated and heartbroken. How do you rebuild faith after something like this?" As Copeland begins his sentence, the empire he built over 6 decades lies in ruins, its assets frozen or being liquidated to compensate victims. The private jets that became symbols of his excess are being sold. The sprawling ministry headquarters stands half empty, and the television broadcasts that reached millions have gone dark. Yet perhaps the most significant impact of this case will be on the invisible landscape of faith and trust. For many, Copeland represented not just a religious leader, but a direct channel to divine blessing. His conviction forces a reevaluation not just of one man's ministry, but of an entire theological system that promised material rewards for spiritual devotion. In his final statement to the court before being led away, Copeland remained defiant. "History will vindicate me, and God will reward those who stood by me in this hour of persecution." Whether that prophecy comes true remains to be seen, but what is certain is that the legacy of Kenneth Copeland has been forever altered by today's historic sentence.